My name is Greg Remke, and I wanted to cover today some ideas on the Bill of Rights, the New Deal, and the United Nations Universal Declaration. For debaters that are debating United Nations reform or abolish, the NCFCA debate topic, this is an opportunity to sort of look back into the history of the United Nations and apply some of the lessons from that history to reform ideas today. Turns out this is it's a relevant topic for sort of unexpected ways. Even if you think the United Nations is not repairable for some reason or is a calamity, by showing that the United Nations has its roots in many of the policies that are in the New Deal, you have a way to look at both the United Nations and the New Deal. So let me explain this, and maybe this will be helpful. Also, I wanted to mention, and maybe you could say this is sponsored by the Bill of Rights Institute. The Bill of Rights Institute has a Constitutional Academy program this summer for high school age students, and a number of homeschool students have attended. And I wanted to draw from some of the materials on their website and recommend the program to you as well. So you can find out more about this on the Bill of Rights Institute.org website and look for their Constitutional Academy and read about the program. And if you have questions, let me know. So looking at the Bill of Rights themselves for the United States, the goal of this presentation is sort of contrast the Bill of Rights with the United Nations Universal Declaration on Rights. And it's important to understand that the United Nations Declaration really is patterned on what's been called by Richard Epstein Bill of Rights 2.0. That is the New Deal's sort of rewriting of the Bill of Rights or attempted additions to the Bill of Rights, which are really the sort of the core of the modern welfare state. That is and I'll explain that as we go. So Franklin Roosevelt is pushing the New Deal and the Four Freedoms, and Eleanor Roosevelt is involved in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is Eleanor Roosevelt here. As you read these two documents, the beginning rights, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, very similar, but the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights goes much further in the claimed rights that they're promoting. So you can look at this online, and for debaters, I assume you have. Also, there's a resource from the Hillsdale College called constitutionreader.com, and you can see the contrasting views of the founders and what they viewed natural rights or political rights were versus the progressives, who wanted a much wider definition of what government should do to help people. The founders, what government should do to help people is not oppress people. That is, defend rights from government, defend the country from other governments, but let people live their lives. The progressives argued that the government should do much more, should protect dignity, should provide a whole range of redistributive programs that would, in theory, make people better off. I highly recommend for those want to know more about the Great Depression and the New Deal, Amity Shale's book, The Forgotten Man, looks at the history of the Great Depression, looks at the history of the Franklin Roosevelt Brain Trust, the people involved in sort of rewriting the Constitution or adding the programs that the federal government does in the name of getting out of the Depression, but also we're embodying the progressive ideas that had come over from Europe and influenced American intellectuals through German universities and PhD programs and a whole manner of things. But you can see from the historical archives what people actually thought, what they planned, what they did. And this is the intellectual history of the New Deal, but it's also the intellectual history of the United Nations, or that part of the United Nations that is promoting human rights, rather than just the part of the United Nations that is trying to find a way to adjudicate disputes and prevent war. So the New Deal economic programs enacted in the U.S. Between 33 and 36 is sort of New Deal Part 1, but then the Supreme Court changed, invalidated much of the original New Deal. This is sort of state capitalism. That is, the government should take a larger role in sort of shaping and managing and harnessing the capitalist system. And came from FDR's brain trust. And these are the people described in the beginning of The Forgotten Man. These brain trust intellectuals are on their way to the Soviet Union to see the future. So the first New Deal, 33, 34, and then the second New Deal, that is after the Supreme Court invalidated the first New Deal, much of the legislation, these policies were rewritten. The Supreme Court was reshaped in a sense, and the second New Deal are the 35 to 38 programs. Now, I'm arguing that the New Deal was a turning point in American history. Now, obviously, the Revolutionary War was, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War. There's lots of turning points, that is, changes the size and the scope of government through wars and over time expanding the size and scope of the federal government. But the New Deal is the sort of the core of the various welfare programs that we have today. So if you look at the New Deal and New Deal foreign policy, you can look at what FDR called the four freedoms in his speech of 1941. He asked Congress to support a plan for international protection of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. So you can see these marvelous Norman Rockwell drawings that Rockwell did on his own without the government particularly wanting him to, but these became emblematic of promoting the idea, freedom of speech. The man stands up in the local assembly or local gathering and says what he thinks is true. Freedom of worship. Of course, these are connected to buying war bonds, the first ones to support World War II. A freedom from want, a scene from a Thanksgiving dinner that, why are we fighting? Well, we're fighting so people around the world should be free from want. Ours to fight for freedom from fear. We want to protect the countries of Europe and Asia from totalitarian dictators. And in a sense, the U.S. foreign policy, the New Deal foreign policy, was in part a Keynesian effort to boost the economy. Congress no longer would allow Franklin Roosevelt to just ramp up domestic spending as he did in the first New Deal phase, but for foreign policy, for Lend-Lease Act and for investment in military war preparations, that was not only to boost the economy and create jobs and get us out of the recession, it was also in this internationalization of the four freedoms. That is, the four freedoms, not just for Americans, but people all over the world deserve these freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Now, contrasting this sort of New Deal 2.0, or this new effort for the federal government to expand its role, freedom of speech is in the original Bill of Rights, is freedom from worship and others, but freedom from want, what's that about? How would the federal government free people from want? And the argument is this is a call for the federal government to establish a social safety net, that is to provide food for people that are hungry, to provide jobs for people that need jobs. But to do that, the federal government has to tax other people to get money to provide the food. They have to promote public works programs and expending to create jobs. The classical liberal perspective is that these things were done by the private sector, by churches, by charities, by self-help organizations, by fraternal societies, self-insurance. So there was a broad range of non-government social safety nets that came through family, church, and community organizations. When the federal government stepped in and said the federal government or governments must do this, that was a shift. And that's part of what the New Deal was a shift to say, well, all these things have existed, but they're not enough. They're not efficient. They can't handle the problems of the Great Depression. So Roosevelt calls for legislation to protect human dignity around the world. He says the security of men, women, and children of the nation against certain hazards and vicissitudes of life. This became a later call for international protection of such rights, and the United Nations was the agency to do that. Now again, not everybody involved in the UN was on board with these broader sort of economic activities, but gradually the United Nations expanded to do more. And this distinct contrast between the Soviet sort of client states on how the government should do these things versus the traditional English, American, Western European views is, been a debate through the history of the United Nations. So you can look online. There's an interesting lesson plan by Ivan Erdang, a high school teacher, called Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, Human Rights and the Creation of the United Nations. And in this, students are asked to define human rights, to evaluate how the Depression created an opportunity for FDR, for progressives that were influencing FDR, to reform government and to improve the plight of the common man. That is, this is a call, and Ivan Erdang here is enthusiastic about the federal government taking a larger role in the economy and providing these things. But the argument is the crisis atmosphere of the New Deal and the vast number of people unemployed in the Great Depression led to the New Deal having much more power than it otherwise might. Lots of people were on board. Obviously, there's much more to know about the New Deal, and I'm not claiming to cover it here, but just arguing that the federal government expanded its role. In this lesson plan, they asked for people to define human rights and what Eleanor Roosevelt in her essay, What We're Fighting For. So then World War II became not just to defeat the Germans and the Japanese, but to promote human rights around the world. That is, to guarantee these 4 freedoms for people around the world, and basically to take the New Deal, which was the expansionist view of what government should do in the United States, and push that around the world. That the United States was not only going to guarantee the rights of freedom from want and so forth for Americans, we were going to take part in this new international effort to guarantee these freedoms around the world. So this lesson plan calls for compare and contrast the 4 freedoms that were part of the New Deal with the Atlantic Charter and with the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. That is, look at the rights and discussed in each of these. Then another step to analyze the preamble of Article 1 of the United Nations Charter. So this is an effort for students to go in and study the sort of the founding documents of the United Nations to see what it's about, just like you would study the founding documents of the United States, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, to see what it's about, or what it was originally intended to be about. So here again are the United Nations Declaration of Rights. And so we're taking a broad sort of background question of the philosophy of government. What's the just role? What's the proper role of government in a free society? What should the government do? And the New Deal, again, is a turning point that expands what the federal government claims it should do. And most, democratic socialists, or that's not the word that Democrats like, social democrats, what social democrats often claim, government should do much more because it has the power, it's the ability, it's got experts, it should take a role in providing freedom from want for people in America and around the world. So the Bill of Rights Institute, again, online, they have scholarship contests for students. Each year they have articles, materials you can find, lesson plans and sources, as you can in many sites, but the Bill of Rights Institute is one that I would recommend. We're looking at the origin of rights, the role of government, the treatment of property, and how that fits in. And you can, of course, download the Bill of Rights from online and look at the details and read the background to it. And really the Bill of Rights is the agenda of the anti-federalists, the people that were against what they argued was the larger powers of the federal government, and the view is the Bill of Rights were to limit those powers. So backing up from this now, in the next part we're going to do a thinking about rights, and we're going to look at the sort of positive rights and negative rights. I'm going to stop for a minute here and we'll continue that in the next session. Thank you.